Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Bitcoin is currently just over $45,000. We have discussed this idea of getting a rally into the spot ETF. And I don't typically talk about the news that much, but yesterday there was a tweet from the SEC saying, in fact, that the spot ETF had been approved. And then just a few moments later, they deleted that tweet and said that it was that their account had been compromised. So, if you were watching the markets yesterday, especially on some of the lower time frames, like on the minute time frame, you can see, just what happened, right? So I think at about 3:11 Eastern, right here, the SEC tweeted it out, and then Bitcoin popped up just south of 48K, and then it came crashing all the way back down to below 45K. But what's interesting is this wick right here, so not the low one, but the one that just came after it, that wick corresponded to when they came out and said, oh, just kidding, this is not actually approved. So quite a lot of mental gymnastics yesterday on Twitter, especially as the market made these considerable moves. And, I know we follow Bitcoin dominance quite a lot, and, it's not my goal to just not talk about it when it's down. And so this is not a Bitcoin dominance video, but I do just want to say, it did take a pretty big hit. It's down to 53.61%. Still well up on the month, and again, I'm not even sure if you go look at like a minute time frame for dominance. It'd be interesting to see what dominance did during that time. So you can see that dominance actually wicked all the way up to about 55.33%. So I believe that's a new cycle high, 55.33. The weird thing that TradingView does, I guess, is that they don't always include lower time frame stuff like on minute time frame. And so while it did go up to 55.33 on the minute chart, you can see that on the daily it more or less topped out at around half, at around 1% below that. So just wanted to provide an update there. I know it has taken a bit of a hit recently. One of the things that we've mentioned many times are at least comparing this business cycle with the last business cycle, and it's a very difficult thing, mainly because you can always look back at the last cycle and say, all right, well, when the Fed pivoted, that was not that great for Bitcoin. The problem is we don't know when that's going to be, right? I mean, we can speculate on it, and the market is always speculating on it. If you were to go look today, the market is saying about a 60, if you combine these two probabilities, right, about a 70% chance or so, 69.5% chance that we'll have a rate cut by March. The reason I mentioned that is because, again, last cycle, I cannot promise what's going to happen this cycle, but last cycle, Bitcoin found a local high just before the first rate cut. The problem, of course, is we don't know when the first rate cut's going to come. If it comes in March, then and it were to play out in a similar manner as over here, then, the expectation could be that Bitcoin puts in some type of local top a month before that, right? So like in February. But if on the other hand, the first rate cut doesn't come until, say, May, which at the current time, there's only about a 5% chance, 4.9% chance that the first rate cut's not till May. But it doesn't come till May, then a month before that would be April, which of course is the month in which the Bitcoin halving will occur. To me, it certainly seems like this cycle more than others is much more driven by narratives than anything else. It seems like we're just constantly chasing one narrative to another, whether it's the spot Bitcoin ETF, whether it's people speculating on a spot Ether ETF, whether it could be the Bitcoin halving. And so, some people have sort of argued that dominance could top out, around the spot ETF. And look, guys, anything's possible. I'm not going to sit here. I'm not going to say that it can't. But if you were thinking of what other narrative could be, could push it up, perhaps the halving would be one to look towards. But that's still 3 months away. One of the things that I think that it's worthwhile to look at it, and this is always in terms of managing the downside risk, is just, again, sort of an acknowledgement that if we were to go below the 8-week SMA, which, again, we're not there yet, but if we were to go below it, historically that means, at least in recent years, when you go below the 8-week, you tend to then go to the bull market support band, right? So going below the 8-week tends to take you to the bull market support band. We're not there, right? I mean, like, even though there's been times over here we've got below the 8-week, we then went down to that 20-week SMA or 21-week EMA or even below it, we're still holding the 8-week SMA as support, right? So the market is still trending right now. The 8-week SMA is currently at just over 42K. So the argument, of course, is so long as Bitcoin stays above 42K, then we're still above the 8-week, and it's not clearly risk-off dynamics just yet. And it's important that we acknowledge that, because there are certain metrics that, if they were to give the signal of risk-off, it could imply that Bitcoin needs to go back down and recheck with its bull market support band, which it hasn't really checked in with since October. Now, some of those risk-off indicators that we've discussed, one of which got a bounce today, right? So the Ether Bitcoin valuation had a pretty large move here after taking out the June 2022 low. So one of the things that I've mentioned before is that if we get a weekly close below the June 2022 low, then that, at least in my view, would imply a risk-off signal. As you can see, that last cycle, when we finally closed below this low right here from November of 2017, when we finally closed below it, if you were to overlay Bitcoin USD onto that chart, closing below it essentially gave us a risk-off signal, right? And it didn't mean that Bitcoin didn't hang around that area for a while. In fact, it did. I mean, it even went back up and put in a double top after Ether Bitcoin broke down. The thing to look for today, though, is that while we have wicked below it, we just put out a video on Ether Bitcoin just yesterday. While we did wick below it, we have not put in any daily closes below it. And so until there's a daily close, until there's a weekly close, and we haven't put any weekly closes above it, we also haven't put daily closes below it either, but until there's a weekly close below this level, then it has not yet given the same type of risk-off signal that we got over here. Okay, so again, so far, it's just simply a wick. Nothing more, nothing less. It's just a wick, and I'm not overly interested in wicks. In the video on the Ether Bitcoin pair, I said that it can always get a bounce back up and rally back up to that bull market support band, which is still higher than where it is right now for the Ether Bitcoin pair. So again, one of the risk-off signals would be, in my opinion, a weekly close by Ether Bitcoin below the June 2022 low. That hasn't happened yet, right? And so it's important to respect that and say, all right, well, until that happens, that risk-off signal has not yet materialized in the same way that it did last cycle. Now, again, if Bitcoin were to go below the 8-week, you likely go to the bull market support band. But as long as it's above the 8-week, it's always interesting to think about, like, well, what are the next targets for Bitcoin USD so long that it can hold that 8-week SMA? And of course, there's plenty of them that we can take a look at. One of which is actually more so based on the total market cap, but you can kind of apply it to Bitcoin fairly easily. If you were to look at, let me go to a weekly time frame of total market, you can see actually that if we connect the dots, right? So just sort of connecting the dots at the tops there, here, and here, and then connecting the bottoms, at least the weekly close, you can see that the 2019 rally that topped out just before the first rate cut arrived, topped out at the midpoint of this trend line. Now, the midpoint of this trend line this week would be about 1.9 trillion or so. So from the current price to get to 1.9 trillion, the market would have to move up. Let me zoom in here so I can get it a little bit more accurate, because I'm not I'm not really, it's hard to see exactly where it is, right? So right now, that would correspond to about a 14 to 15% move to get you to the total market cap of 1.9 trillion. Now remember, that's just total market. If Bitcoin were to go up 15% and total market stays constant, then you still haven't hit that level. But if Bitcoin were to see a rise up to, let's say 15%, that puts it in the low 50K range, right? The low 50K range. So the low 50K range, assuming that it can lift the rest of the asset class up commensurate with itself, the low 50K range would put total market cap at sort of the midpoint of this channel, which again, you can see that it has held some type of significance back in August 2022 and in June of 2019, and of course in July of 2018. So that I think would be a relevant level to sort of keep in mind, is total market cap getting up to the midpoint of this channel. Other than that, I mean, we can always go look at some of the other metrics, some of which are more interesting, I think, than others. One of which, it would be that if we were to go over to some of the charts over here, one of which is the running 1-year ROI that's currently coming in at around, let me see if it'll load here. Yeah, at around 2.588. Okay, so it is getting kind of extended, but you can see that the last couple of cycles, it did go a little bit above that if you were to compare it to a similar point before getting a pullback. Now remember, Bitcoin started to rally in January of 2023, really starting around this time. So if the 1-year ROI is going to go up from here, then the price of Bitcoin would have to go up quicker. Otherwise, the running 1-year ROI will top out. For instance, if you were to project out a price, even at the current prices, let's just even put in 48K, right? If you were to put in a price of 48K a month from now, you're still going to see the 1-year ROI come back down because, again, in January of 2023, we saw Bitcoin rally. So that's oftentimes you'll see Bitcoin gets a pullback on the 1-year running ROI after a year-long rally or so. That's one metric. There's a few others that we could look at as well. One of which is taking the ROI from the 2022 low. So if you do that and just comparing it to the last two cycles, zooming in, you can see we're actually still in between the ROI of the last two cycles. So we're above cycle 3, but below cycle 4. Right, so you can see right here, the purple line, this is the current cycle. Green line is last cycle, and then the orange line is the cycle before that. And you can see the distinct characteristics of them. Like last cycle, we of course had the pandemic drop. Cycle before that, Bitcoin just sort of slowly trended, and then eventually got another move up on day, in the day 500 range or so. And again, right now we're currently on day 425. So day 500, that would be getting you closer to, to the halving, right? Day 500, because that would be about 3 months from now. So, when I look at these sorts of charts and think about, what are the most likely outcomes, if Bitcoin were to accelerate to the upside immediately, let's say on spot ETF approval or something, then it might need to cool down closer to the halving. But if, on the other hand, it doesn't do that and it just kind of trends sideways for a couple months, then you could make the case that it'll make that move going into the halving. And so a lot of it, again, is very much narrative driven, right? It's very much narrative driven. And I just go back to these ideas of what are various signals that could be interpreted as risk off, one of which is the breakdown of Ether Bitcoin on the weekly time frame. But that hasn't happened, and as much as I would like to see it break down, because I think it makes the most sense to me, I also have to be honest and say, well, it hasn't happened yet. And this is a pretty big move by the Ether Bitcoin pair. I'm not going to pretend like it's not. If we were to look at the daily on this, it's not like we haven't had these moves, and we've seen Ether Bitcoin slowly go down and then just get a crazy move to the upside. Is what it does, right? And again, if you were to look at the relative strength index on the Ether Bitcoin pair, really going all the way back to the merge, maybe even before the merge, it has been putting in a lot of lower highs in terms of that daily RSI. And I did say in the video, if Ether Bitcoin does get a bounce after taking out these prior lows, you can see every time it puts in a new low, it then gets a bounce. But if it does take out that low and gets a bounce, I would be looking towards that, that bull market support band. And it's always possible that it comes back up and sweeps this level here, right? Comes back up and then sort of fades down again. Historically, when it bounces like this, it then, takes a little while to fade back down. Like as you can see, right? You get a pretty sharp bounce and then it takes a while to fade back down, right? A pretty sharp bounce, and then it takes a long time for it to then fade back down to where that bounce actually originated from. So just want to point that out. So for me, when I'm looking for to interpret a potential risk-off signal for Bitcoin would be the weekly close of Ether Bitcoin below the June 2022 low. And again, that hasn't happened yet. So until that happens, I will still continue to look at this and say, all right, well, as long as it's above the 8-week SMA, then the next, what are the next targets? And of course, there's other metrics that we could look at as well. We could look at the logarithmic regression rainbow. The band up here is currently just below 49K. Yeah, so the same band that we rallied up to in August 2022 is now at around 49K. So about, I guess a little less than $4,000 above where we currently are. But again, it's also an increasing value, right? Like the regression bands are moving higher as a function of time. And so that would be a level to keep in mind. The other levels of interest would be to sort of looking, just to kind of get an idea of what happened last cycle. Now I go back to this idea of, well, what happened last cycle, of course, does not have to be what happens this cycle. In fact, my base case is that it probably won't be the same thing. Every single cycle seems to play out somewhat differently. If you were to take a look at the fib retracement tool last cycle, you can see that Bitcoin topped out at the 618, actually just a little bit higher than the 618 retracement. We haven't reached that level yet. We have come somewhat close, but we haven't actually reached it. And remember, last cycle it went above that level. So the 618 currently is around 48.5, measured from the second peak. Of course, if you measure it from the first peak, we've already reached the 618, which I've previously pointed out. But reaching that level would, correspond to this same move here where it takes out that dead cat bounce high from the bear market year, right? So this is the dead cat bounce high from the bear market year, and it's trying to take that out. And you can see that in 2019, it was able to take out that high just before the first rate cut arrived, right? Just before the first rate cut arrived, which occurred in July. So just before that, Bitcoin was able to take out the Q1 dead cat bounce high from the bear market year. So this time, the Q1 bear market, sort of the dead cat bounce from the bear market year is right around 47K or so. Right around 47K. So we actually have already taken that out, but again, last cycle it actually went above it by about 15% or so. There's that 15% again, right? That 15% number kind of coming back from total market cap and seeing where above this would it need to go to even reach the that part of the midpoint, and that would be about a 15% move. But again, the longer it takes, the higher Bitcoin or the asset class would have to go to reach the midpoint, right? If we don't reach it till March, then that would imply a 20% move to reach the midpoint of that channel. So a lot of things to consider there. And again, there's always other outcomes as well in the short term. For instance, there could be a larger pullback back to the bull market support band to check in before getting a bounce there. We've seen that before. And in fact, if you were to look at the short-term bubble risk of Bitcoin, what you'll notice is that we actually extended to the same level that we extended to back in March of 2023, in fact, right? So, and the first top here did not actually correspond to that local top before we then bled back down to the bull market support band, right? You can see it pretty clearly. This high here did not correspond to the top as well. So you can kind of see that, like, it looks to me, there are some similarities, right? You get this high, the extension from the 20-week SMA right here, but it did not mark the top for that rally. You can see that Bitcoin did extend that rally a bit further, and then it cooled off back down to the bull market support band. And then the same thing over here, right? Like, it hit that extension from the 20-week, and it's gone up, right, a little bit more, right? It's gone up a little bit more. We'll see if it continues to play out. If it plays out like it did, about 10 months ago or so, then it would imply, within the next couple of weeks or so, getting a larger pullback to that bull market support band. I will remind you that, you could always have an example where Ether Bitcoin does not break down in the short term, but Bitcoin still gets a correction, right? Where Bitcoin goes back down and it did not go up high enough to break Ether Bitcoin off of its support. And then we have to just kick the can down the road and we try again. We try again potentially in another month or two. So I would be aware of that potential idea as well. And, and again, today could be a really interesting day if the spot ETF is approved, right? I mean, if that stuff is approved, then price action could be all over the place. We saw what happened on the minute chart earlier once the market thought it was approved, and then that completely changed. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm essentially just looking at these indicators that we just discussed, looking at like ROI from the bear market low, looking at things like the running 1 year ROI, and here's the short-term bubble risk that we just pulled up. So those are some of the indicators that I'm sort of watching, and then of course there's also just comparing these moves, the extension from the 20-week SMA compared to what we did over here, and also the Ether Bitcoin pair, right? For me, the Ether Bitcoin pair is an interesting view into crypto because I do consider Ether a blue chip, but it also has been bleeding against Bitcoin since the merge. And there's definitely some different views right now that are probably worthwhile to discuss. So one of those views that some people have speculated on is that this is the low of Ether Bitcoin. And guys, I mean, the markets humble all of us, right? I'll be clear about that. I've been bearish on Ether Bitcoin since the merge. I do think it's more likely to eventually break down than up, but I also think it's worthwhile to consider other viewpoints. And that's why I've said before, if you want to hedge, it's worthwhile to hedge. With that said, risk off signals for Bitcoin and say for the altcoin market last cycle did not occur until Ether Bitcoin broke down on the weekly, right? Until it broke down on the weekly, the risk off signal did not occur. And I keep coming back to this idea, well, what if Bitcoin tops out a local top a month before the first rate cut, just like last cycle? And we can look at that and be like, all right, well, that makes sense. That means, could be any time, right? Could be February if the rate cut comes in March. But then that's true. But then what if the rate cut doesn't come until May, right? And then you just, you kick the can down the road. And there are reasons why it could be delayed until May. For instance, if the labor market were to continue to remain tight and the economic data comes in extremely hot, let's say inflation, we're going to be getting an inflation report relatively soon. If that were to come in relatively hot, then that could delay. When the first rate cut will come. And if it does delay when the first rate cut will come, then it could delay, the idea of when could there be a local top before the first rate cut arrives, right? So it's just like the market, it's sort of like a game of chicken between like the Federal Reserve and the stock market, because the stock market just sort of keeps slowly going higher. And the Fed, you can kind of get the sense that Powell would like to cut because there is some weakness in the labor market. But as long as risk assets keep going up, you potentially also have the wealth effect taking place. So it's really, it's really a game of chicken to some degree. One other way to look at the market that I was looking at earlier is to look at the relative strength index of Bitcoin, and actually look to see, we've actually on the weekly, we've actually been overbought since October. But as I've said, using RSI to buy and sell is a fool's errand, right? Because it can remain overbought for months, sometimes years, can remain oversold for months or years. In fact, in 2020, you can see that the weekly RSI crossed into overbought territory in October, which is exactly when it crossed here. You can see that it also did not durably break down until April. So I think the argument would be, well, if the first rate cut arrives in March, then perhaps the weekly RSI will break down in February. But if the first rate cut does not arrive until May, let's say economic data comes through such that the Fed feels like they have to keep holding until May, then perhaps it'll play out something like that, where the weekly RSI doesn't sort of fall back down until we get to right around the time of the halving. So different ways to look at it. There's also one other metric, just while I'm thinking about it before I go to pull up, and that's the fear and greed index. We're currently at a level of 73. To look at the values of it more specifically, you can see that it actually broke to a new local high at 76 to extreme greed, which it had not been at 76 throughout this entire move. The reason why that's interesting is because you can see that in 2019, just before that mid-cycle top, Bitcoin went all the way, the fear and greed went all the way up to 95. So that might be another risk-off signal if it arrives, would be a fear and greed print of in the 90s, right? In the 90s would be, I think, a risk-off signal. So I think it really just depends on how long this move takes, whether Bitcoin can break the Ether Bitcoin valuation down or not. I know people are speculating, of course, on the same type of spot ETF stuff for Ethereum, which could certainly delay things as well. But just trying to be honest about the market, and just a reminder, my views, while I do feel very strongly about them at times, they're often wrong. And that's the truth. They're often wrong. And I just want you to remember that. And I just want people to have a strategy, stick to it. And in terms of navigating the market, right? We can talk about short-term price action, implications of that. But in terms of actually navigating the market and having exposure to the market, my suggestion would be to just have a strategy, stick to it, and ignore all the news and all that other sort of stuff. That's probably your best bet. Anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.